The elders had always been careful with their words. They didn't shout warnings or make grand gestures. They spoke quietly, as if the message might disappear if it were too loud. For generations, they had told the young ones something simple, yet heavy with meaning: never provoke humanity beyond its limit. It was a lesson that had been passed down from a time most people had forgotten, a time when the world had shifted in ways that no one could undo that most of the village's young people didn't understand. They thought it was an old superstition, a story meant to make children behave. They saw the elders sitting under the big trees, recounting these warnings to anyone who would listen, and they laughed softly among themselves. Why would humans need to be feared? They whispered, "We're all humans. What could possibly happen?" But there were some who listened quietly. They paid attention to the way the elders' eyes seemed to carry a weight that went far beyond simple storytelling. There was a calm, unshakable seriousness in their tone. Sometimes the elders didn't even finish the stories. They would pause, stare at the horizon, and let silence do the work. And in that silence, the villagers who had patience to notice could feel the depth of what was being said, that the village itself was small, almost hidden in the folds of distant hills. It wasn't on any major map, and most travelers passed it by without a second thought. Life here moved slowly, measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, and the occasional festival that brought everyone together. Children ran through fields barefoot, chasing chickens or racing each other for no reason other than the joy of movement. The adults worked quietly in their fields, tending crops, feeding animals, and repairing homes with care. And through it all, the elders remained a steady presence, a reminder that the past carried lessons that the present could not ignore. One elder, who was older than most could imagine, often sat near the edge of the village with a small group of listeners gathered around. His voice was soft but firm, the kind that made people lean in without realizing it. There was a time, he began, when humanity faced a choice, a moment when anger could have destroyed everything. And yet, through courage, wisdom, and unity, humans changed the course of history. But never forget this: there are some sparks you cannot contain once they ignite. That is why we must never provoke humanity beyond its limit. The young ones frowned. They wanted specifics. What happened? One of them asked. The elder did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, where the sun painted the sky with gold and pink. Some things, he said, slowly, are remembered not because they are easy to tell, but because they are impossible to forget. Even without a full story, the warning took root in subtle ways. In the days that followed, some villagers noticed small changes in the behavior of the younger generation. They were more cautious, more thoughtful. They began to notice the way their actions could affect others, even people they had never met. They saw that anger, when allowed to grow unchecked, could ripple outward, creating consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine. There were also moments that reminded everyone why the elders' warnings mattered. A few years back, a minor argument had started in the neighboring region. It was small, almost insignificant at first, a misunderstanding between two groups over resources. But within days, it had grown into something bigger. Humans from nearby villages had stepped in to mediate, offering assistance, negotiating, and helping people find common ground. Their actions were not violent, not loud or chaotic, but there was an intensity in the way they acted. They worked tirelessly, sometimes risking themselves to protect others. The elders had watched quietly from a distance. They nodded to one another, knowing that humanity had once again reminded the world of its strength, not through destruction, but through courage and determination. And yet, they also understood that this strength could not be taken for granted. There was a fine line between control and chaos, between patience and breaking point. The warning was not just about past events. It was about the future, about making sure that no one ever tested humanity's limits again. Life in the village continued, but the memory of the elders' words lingered. In the evenings, people would sit outside their homes, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. Some of the younger villagers, who had once laughed at the warnings, began to ask questions. They wanted to understand the reason behind the caution. They wanted to know what had happened in the past that had made the elders so serious, so careful. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the same elder gathered a small group of teenagers and young adults. "I will tell you a story tonight," he said. "It is not a story meant to scare you, but to remind you. Remember, understanding the past helps you navigate the future. There was a time when the world could have fallen apart, and it was humanity that prevented it." The listeners leaned closer. Their curiosity had grown stronger than their doubt. "Many years ago," the elder began, "the world was divided in ways you cannot imagine. Nations, communities, and tribes often fought over power, resources, and pride. Conflicts were common, and trust was rare. One small incident, something that seemed almost trivial, sparked anger that could have spread like fire. And it was humanity that had to step in, not as soldiers, but as protectors. Not with weapons, but with courage, intelligence, and a will stronger than any force the world had ever seen." He paused, letting the words sink in. They faced the provocation calmly, but with determination. They did not act out of revenge, but out of responsibility. They organized, they helped, they defended the innocent. And slowly the tide turned. The anger that could have destroyed everything was contained, and the world shifted because of their actions. That is why we say never provoke humanity. It is not the threat of violence you must fear. It is the power of collective will, the strength of conscience, and the determination to protect what is right. The young villagers sat silently. For the first time, they understood that the warning was not just a story for children, nor a superstition. It was a lesson learned through experience. They realized that humanity was not merely flesh and bone. It was an idea, a force that could rise to meet challenges in ways that no one could predict. And in that moment, they began to see the elders not just as old storytellers, but as guardians of knowledge that the world could not afford to forget. As night fell, the stars began to twinkle over the village. The air was cool, and the smell of earth and grass filled the senses. The young ones walked home slowly, their minds alive with thoughts they could not yet fully understand. The elder watched from the shadows, knowing that the seed had been planted. One day, these young villagers might face situations that tested their patience and courage. And when that time came, the lesson of the elders would guide them. It was a quiet, simple moment in a small village, but it carried a weight that stretched far beyond the hills. Humanity's potential, its strength, and its unity were not just stories or legends. They were real, tangible forces that could shape the world. And in that village, under the careful eyes of the elders, the next generation had begun to learn the truth, that some sparks could not be contained, some power could not be ignored, and some lessons must be remembered for the world to endure. Even if the villagers never fully understood it in their youth, the elders knew that the lesson would follow them throughout their lives. It was not a warning of fear, but of respect for the power that comes from human determination, compassion, and courage. And it was a reminder that the world could shift in an instant when humanity chose to rise, protect, and act. In that quiet village, as the moon rose high and shadows stretched across the land, the elders whispered the final words of the night, soft enough for only the closest listeners to hear. Never provoke humanity, for its heart is stronger than any force, its will greater than any threat, and its courage capable of shifting the world forever. After the elders' warning had settled in the minds of the villagers, life continued in its usual rhythm, but something had subtly changed. The younger ones who had listened carefully began to notice the world differently. They saw how small actions could ripple outward and how anger, pride, and misunderstanding could grow far beyond what anyone expected. It was during this time that a small incident occurred in a neighboring region, one that would test everything the elders had spoken about. A group of people from another community had traveled through the area, carrying messages and goods. The locals, unfamiliar with their customs and impatient with their presence, acted roughly. Words were said in anger, gestures were misread, and a minor dispute quickly escalated into a confrontation. At first, it seemed trivial, almost laughable. People passing by could not understand why the travelers appeared upset. A few villagers even whispered that it was silly to take offense at something so small. But the elders were quiet and observant. They knew that small sparks could ignite large fires if not handled carefully. The humans involved in the incident did not respond with violence. They did not lash out or retaliate. Instead, they remained calm, speaking firmly but respectfully, trying to explain their position and resolve the misunderstanding. They listened as much as they spoke. And yet, their calmness was not weakness. There was an undeniable presence in the way they carried themselves, a kind of silent strength that could be felt rather than measured. As news of the dispute spread, more people began to pay attention. Communities nearby watched closely, curious to see what would happen next. Many expected chaos, believing that humans, when provoked, would act impulsively. But they were wrong. Humans from nearby villages, hearing of the incident, organized quietly. They did not gather as armies or armed groups. Instead, they came as mediators, helpers, and witnesses, determined to ensure fairness and protect those who might be vulnerable. By the second day, the situation had grown tense. Some locals had begun to panic, expecting trouble to erupt at any moment. They whispered to one another, "Surely they will strike back. Surely they will not let this go." But the humans remained steadfast, moving calmly among the groups, offering help and listening carefully. They were patient, even when provoked, and determined to find a solution that respected everyone. What made the situation remarkable was how quickly people began to notice the unity among humans. They acted not as individuals seeking revenge, but as a collective, guided by a shared sense of responsibility. When one person spoke, others supported them. When someone was in danger, help arrived immediately. And when tensions rose, the humans did not allow anger to take control. Instead, they turned their focus to solutions, quietly but powerfully shifting the energy of the entire situation. Observers were astonished. They could not understand why humans reacted this way, why they did not respond with violence or resentment. The elders, however, watched with a knowing calm. They had seen it before. They had witnessed moments when humanity's restraint, courage, and unity had changed outcomes that seemed hopeless. And now it was happening again. By the third day, the conflict had grown enough to attract attention from beyond the local region. Messages were sent, news traveled, and more humans arrived, not to fight, but to help organize, mediate, and protect. Each person acted with a quiet confidence, offering assistance, distributing resources, and providing guidance. They created order in a situation that had begun to feel chaotic. The locals who had caused the initial incident were growing uneasy. They had expected fear, submission, or chaos in response to their actions. Instead, they found themselves confronted by patience, understanding, and an unwavering sense of justice. They could feel the weight of human presence, not in force, but in focus. Every human seemed to know what to do, where to go, and how to help. It was as if they shared a single will, united in purpose without needing to speak of it. The villagers who had once doubted the elders began to whisper among themselves. "Maybe the elders were right," some said. "Maybe humanity is stronger than we understand." Others nodded in agreement, realizing that strength did not always show itself in aggression. It could appear quietly, in the way humans supported each other, stayed calm under pressure, and acted with fairness, even when provoked. By the fourth day, the minor conflict had transformed into a story of cooperation and resilience. Humans worked tirelessly to repair the harm that had been done. They spoke with those affected, offering protection and assistance. They organized resources for those in need and helped to rebuild trust among the communities. What had begun as a potentially explosive confrontation became a demonstration of humanity's capacity to rise above provocation. It was not easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when anger flared, and moments when people feared that the situation would spiral out of control. But the humans remained consistent. Their calmness did not falter. Their focus did not shift from helping, mediating, and protecting. And slowly, the tension began to ease. By the fifth day, even those who had once mocked or doubted humans began to change their view. They saw that humans were not defined by fear, by anger, or by pride. Humans were defined by their ability to act when it mattered most, to step in when injustice threatened, and to do so with courage, intelligence, and compassion. The elders had been right all along. Humanity should never be provoked, not because they were violent, but because their unity and determination could shift the balance of any situation. Some villagers, especially the young ones who had listened to the stories, began to understand why the elders had repeated their warnings so many times. Humanity was not just strong in a physical sense. It was strong in ways that mattered even more through courage, moral clarity, patience, and the willingness to stand for what was right. Even a small group of humans, acting with focus and purpose, could prevent destruction, heal harm, and change the direction of events that might have otherwise gone terribly wrong. When the incident finally ended, the locals were left with a mix of relief and awe. They had seen something extraordinary, something they could not have predicted. They had seen that provoking humans, even in a minor way, did not lead to simple retaliation. It led to organized, thoughtful, and unwavering action that could shift entire communities. And they understood, perhaps for the first time, why the elders' words were not mere stories or warnings. They were truths, learned through history and experience. Back in the village where the elders lived, word of the incident reached them quietly. They did not celebrate, nor did they seem anxious. Instead, they observed and reflected. They knew that the lesson had been reinforced, that another generation had witnessed humanity's power firsthand. And they knew that the world, small as it might seem in these moments, had shifted once again, not through chaos or destruction, but through courage, unity, and the willingness to act when it mattered most. That evening, the elder who had told the story the previous night gathered the young villagers once more. "Did you hear about what happened nearby?" he asked gently. They nodded, eyes wide with understanding. "You see," he continued, "the spark was small, but the response was immense. Humanity did not fight for pride or revenge. It acted for justice, for protection, and for what was right. And that is why we must always remember never provoke humanity, not because it will retaliate with anger, but because it will rise with strength, courage, and unity in ways that can change the world." The young villagers were silent, taking in the words. They felt a quiet respect growing inside them, a respect for what humans could do when they acted together, calmly and with purpose. They realized that strength was not just about power, speed, or force. It was about determination, empathy, courage, and the ability to rise above provocation and protect what mattered most. The elders smiled quietly, knowing that the lesson had been understood, even if only partially. The incident had reinforced what they had always known. Humanity was capable of remarkable things, and its strength could never be underestimated. In the quiet hours of the night, as stars shimmered over the hills and the cool air wrapped around the village. The young ones walked home with new thoughts in their minds. They had seen what could happen when humans were tested, when provoked, and when challenged. And they had learned, in a way that stories alone could not teach, that humanity was a force unlike any other, a force that could rise, protect, and shift the course of events with calm courage and unwavering resolve. By the time the moon rose high and cast silver light over the village, the lesson had been fully absorbed by those who had listened. Humanity's power was not in anger or destruction, but in unity, patience, and purpose. And the young villagers knew, deep in their hearts, that the elders' warning was not just about the past, it was about the future, about ensuring that no one ever underestimated what humanity could do when it chose to rise. And in that moment, the village slept under the quiet night, carrying a new understanding that even the smallest spark, when met with the strength, courage, and unity of humanity, could change the world forever. The days after the minor incident in the neighboring region left a lasting impression on everyone. The villagers in the small mountain community could still feel the weight of what had happened, even though they had not been directly involved. People spoke in whispers about the calm determination of the humans who had stepped in to mediate, protect, and guide. It was no longer a story of a small spark. It was a lesson about what could happen when humanity chose to act. Even within the village, the impact was visible. Children who had once played without thought began to notice how their words and actions affected others. Young people who had been skeptical of the elders' warnings now looked at the stories differently. They understood that humans were not just ordinary individuals. They were part of something greater, something that could unite in ways that no one could ignore. It was during this period that a new challenge began to take shape. The nearby region, still smarting from the minor incident, became restless. Some leaders there believed that they had been humiliated and that they needed to reassert their authority. They did not understand the nature of the human response. They assumed that the calm, collective effort they had witnessed was weakness, that humans could be provoked again if they were pushed hard enough. So they made a plan. It was small at first, almost invisible, a series of actions meant to intimidate and test the limits of humanity's patience. They sent messengers to nearby villages with threatening words. They blocked trade routes, and they created minor obstacles for travelers. At first, it seemed harmless, just a way to show power. But the elders of the mountain village recognized the signs immediately. They had seen this before, long ago, and they knew that even the smallest spark could ignite a fire if not handled with care. Within the human communities, however, there was no panic. When the first messages of provocation arrived, humans gathered quietly to assess the situation. They did not respond with anger, and they did not rush to retaliation. Instead, they organized calmly. Some worked to ensure that travelers and merchants could move safely. Others focused on communication, sending careful messages to neighboring communities, explaining the situation without exaggeration or blame. Still others prepared resources, ready to provide assistance wherever it might be needed. The unity among humans was remarkable. It was not enforced by fear, and it was not motivated by pride. Every action was measured, thoughtful, and focused on resolving the situation without unnecessary conflict. When one community faced a problem, another stepped in to help. When fear or doubt arose, others offered reassurance and guidance. And all the while, humans moved with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. The leaders who had sought to provoke them were baffled. They expected to see chaos, panic, or even submission. Instead, they found order, determination, and unity. Every attempt to intimidate humans seemed to strengthen their resolve rather than weaken it. And slowly, the balance of power began to shift not through violence, but through careful, coordinated action. The elders of the mountain village watched these developments closely. They understood that this was a critical moment. Humanity was being tested, not by chance, but by the deliberate actions of those who underestimated it. And humanity, true to its nature, responded not with reckless force, but with courage, strategy, and compassion. The elders saw the lessons of the past being repeated, and they knew that the world was about to witness a shift that few could fully comprehend. By the third day of the provocation, humans had mobilized resources in ways that were quiet but effective. Safe routes were established for travelers, communication networks were strengthened, and support systems were put in place to ensure that no one would be harmed unnecessarily. Communities that had previously been distant from one another began to cooperate, sharing information, supplies, and guidance. What could have been a crisis instead became a demonstration of coordination and unity. Observers from the provocative region grew frustrated. They could not understand why their efforts had failed to provoke the expected response. Every attempt to sow fear, confusion, or conflict was met with calm, organized action. It became clear to them, slowly and reluctantly, that the humans were not reacting out of fear or pride. They were reacting out of responsibility, empathy, and a commitment to protect what was right. In the mountain village, the younger generation could see the unfolding events from afar. They followed the news, they talked with travelers who passed through, and they observed the human actions closely. The lessons of the elders began to make more sense. They saw that humanity's strength was not only in physical ability or intelligence, but in its capacity to rise to challenges with purpose, patience, and moral clarity. The elders' warnings were not about brute strength. They were about the extraordinary power of collective human will. As the week progressed, the humans' efforts expanded. They reached out to communities that had previously been disconnected, bringing guidance, assistance, and reassurance. They organized volunteer groups, negotiated compromises, and ensured that safety and fairness were maintained at every level. Every action reinforced the lesson that humanity's response to provocation was not predictable by traditional measures of power. It was measured, deliberate, and remarkably effective. Even the provocative leaders could not ignore it any longer. They had expected chaos, weakness, or submission. Instead, they were confronted with a force that was invisible but undeniable. It was not physical. It was the power of people acting together with intelligence, empathy, and unwavering resolve. They had underestimated humans, and that mistake was beginning to show. Back in the mountain village, the elders spoke quietly to the young ones. "You are witnessing what we have always warned about," one said. "This is the power of humanity, not in destruction, but in courage, responsibility, and unity. Never forget this. The world shifts when humans act together for what is right. That is why the warning exists." The younger villagers listened intently, their minds alive with understanding. For the first time, they began to grasp that humanity's strength was far more than physical or political. It was moral, strategic, and deeply human. Every calm action, every careful plan, every moment of courage contributed to a larger force that could not easily be ignored. By the end of the week, the provocations had largely been neutralized. Travelers were safe, communities were connected, and peace, however tentative, had returned. But the impact of the events lingered. Humans had demonstrated their extraordinary capacity to rise above provocation, to act decisively without aggression, and to protect what mattered most. The mountain villagers discussed the events late into the evening. They spoke quietly, thoughtfully, without exaggeration or pride. The elders listened, satisfied that the lesson had been absorbed. "You see," one said, "humanity is not weak when provoked. It is focused. It is strong in ways that cannot always be measured. And it has the ability to shift the world quietly, without chaos. If it chooses to act with purpose. In the quiet hours of the night, as stars shone over the hills and the air cooled. The young villagers reflected on what they had learned. They understood that humanity's strength was not measured by immediate action, loud confrontation, or physical force. It was measured by patience, courage, empathy, and the willingness to act collectively in a way that created lasting change. And so, the lesson of the elders was reinforced once again. Humanity could not be provoked without consequences, not because it would strike blindly, but because it would rise with calm determination, focus, and the power to change situations that others believed to be uncheckable. The young villagers felt a quiet respect growing inside them, a respect for the true nature of human strength. By the time the moon reached its peak and cast silver light over the village, the understanding had settled into their hearts. The lesson was no longer a distant story or a warning whispered on quiet nights. It was real, tangible, and undeniable. They had seen how humans could act when tested, how they could organize, protect, and rise above provocation. And they knew, deep down, that this was only a glimpse of what humanity was truly capable of. As sleep came over the village, the elders whispered to one another softly, satisfied that the lesson had been witnessed and absorbed. Humanity's extraordinary capacity had once again been demonstrated, not through aggression, but through intelligence, unity, and courage. The world had shifted quietly, subtly, and irreversibly. And in the hearts of the next generation, the seed of understanding had taken root. The night was silent, but the lesson remained alive. Humanity was not a force to provoke recklessly. Its strength lay not in anger, but in focus. Its courage was quiet, but unshakable. And its ability to rise, protect, and act collectively was a power that could change the world forever. The days that followed were unlike any the villagers had ever seen. The world outside their small mountain community seemed to be quietly changing, though no one could put a finger on exactly how. The minor conflict that had begun as a provocation in a neighboring region had grown into something far more significant, a demonstration of human unity and determination. That touched countless lives. News traveled slowly at first, carried by travelers and word of mouth, but it was enough to reach the villagers. People spoke in hushed tones about the organized efforts they had witnessed, the calm and deliberate way humans responded to threats, and the quiet power that seemed to radiate from their actions. Children listened closely to these stories, their eyes wide with fascination. Young villagers who had once laughed at the elders' warnings now understood that there was truth behind every word. The humans involved were no strangers to challenge. They had faced provocation before, and each time they had chosen a path that was both firm and measured. They did not act out of anger, nor did they let pride dictate their decisions. Instead, they responded with intelligence, courage, and a commitment to protect those who could not protect themselves. Communities that had once been divided found common ground, and strangers who had once been fearful became allies. The provocateurs, however, were growing restless. They could not understand why their attempts to intimidate or provoke humans had failed so completely. Every effort to create fear or disorder was met with patience, planning, and action that was impossible to predict. They began to realize, slowly and uncomfortably, that they had underestimated the humans. Their assumptions about weakness or passivity had been entirely wrong. In the mountain village, the elders observed these developments quietly. They knew that the world was shifting in ways that few could fully comprehend. The humans' response was not just about the immediate situation. It was about something much larger. It was about showing the strength of collective effort, the power of moral clarity, and the importance of acting with purpose, even when provoked. By the third day of the new challenge, the humans had created networks of support that reached far beyond the original conflict zone. Communities worked together to share information, resources, and guidance. Safe pathways were established for those traveling through tense regions. People in vulnerable positions were assisted immediately, sometimes by volunteers who traveled great distances to provide help. The scale and efficiency of these efforts astonished observers, even those who had long doubted humanity's abilities. The provocateurs tried to escalate their tactics, hoping to break the humans' resolve. They sent stronger messages, imposed stricter obstacles, and even attempted to block critical supplies. But each move was met with careful planning, coordination, and action by humans. The response was never chaotic or hasty. It was deliberate and precise. Slowly but surely, the provocateurs' influence began to diminish. Their efforts to create fear and disruption were neutralized, not through aggression, but through resilience, unity, and courage. The villagers who had been watching all this unfold began to feel a mixture of awe and understanding. They realized that the elders' warnings had not been about physical strength or weapons. The caution had been about the true nature of humanity, the ability to rise collectively, act with focus, and protect what was right. They saw that strength could be quiet, steady, and profoundly effective. By the fifth day, humans had extended their efforts even further. They communicated with distant communities, offering assistance and creating systems of cooperation that had never existed before. Volunteers worked tirelessly to ensure safety and fairness, often going without sleep or food for the sake of others. Yet they did not complain or seek recognition. Every action was driven by a sense of responsibility and moral clarity, not by personal gain. Observers who had expected chaos were forced to rethink their assumptions. They began to understand that humanity's strength lay not in confrontation or force, but in organization, empathy, and unwavering determination. Every calm, decisive action sent a clear message. Humans could not be provoked without consequence. The consequences were not always violent. Sometimes they were far more effective, shifting alliances, uniting communities, and creating change that could not easily be reversed. In the mountain village, the younger generation began to reflect deeply on what they had witnessed. They discussed the events quietly, thoughtfully, and without exaggeration. They realized that human strength was not something to be feared in a traditional sense. It was something to respect, something that could shape the world in ways that few people truly understood. And they understood why the elders had always warned them. Humanity was capable of extraordinary action when it chose to rise together, with focus and courage. As the week continued, the provocateurs' influence continued to fade. Their attempts at intimidation had failed, and their strategies were falling apart under the weight of human unity and action. Communities that had once been fearful or divided now found solidarity and trust. Trade routes reopened, and cooperation replaced tension. The humans had not needed to fight with weapons or raise their voices in anger. Their strength had been quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. The elders shared these observations with the young villagers one evening. "You see what happens," one said softly. "This is the power of humanity. It is not always visible at first, but it is there. When humans act together with purpose, courage, and empathy, they can change the course of events in ways that no one expects. That is why we warn you, never provoke humanity. Its strength is not in chaos or destruction, but in unity, intelligence, and heart." The young villagers listened intently, their eyes reflecting a newfound understanding. They realized that human strength was not something that could be measured with traditional tools. It was measured in courage, in the ability to act when it mattered most, and in the quiet power of collective determination. They felt a deep respect growing inside them, a recognition that humanity was capable of far more than most people realized. That night, as the stars shimmered over the village and the cool mountain air wrapped around the homes, the young villagers reflected on what they had seen. They thought about the calm determination of humans, the careful planning and coordinated action, and the way people had risen to protect others without seeking glory or recognition. They understood that strength could be quiet and still, but it could move mountains in its own way. Even as sleep came over the village, the lesson remained vivid in their minds. Humanity's ability to act collectively, with patience and courage, had shifted events far beyond what anyone had imagined. The provocateurs had failed, not because they were weak, but because the humans they had underestimated were far stronger than they had anticipated. And the villagers, who had once doubted the elders' warnings, now understood their wisdom fully taught in the quiet of the night. The elders whispered to one another, satisfied that the lesson had been witnessed. Humanity's power had once again been demonstrated, not through aggression or loud displays, but through focus, courage, and unity. And the next generation who had watched carefully would carry this understanding forward, knowing that human strength could change the world quietly, effectively, and permanently dot by dawn. The village was calm, but the lesson had been deeply absorbed. The young villagers went about their day with a sense of awareness that had not been there before. They understood that humanity's strength was not something to provoke lightly, and they understood why the elders' warnings had been repeated for generations. Strength could appear in unexpected ways, and when humans acted together with courage and purpose, the world itself could shift quietly but irreversibly dot as the sun rose over the mountains. Bathing the village in golden light, the elders smiled quietly to themselves. They had seen the truth reaffirmed. Humanity, when provoked with intelligence and purpose, did not respond with chaos. It responded with courage, unity, and the quiet power to change the world. And the villagers, young and old alike, now carried that lesson in their hearts, ready to remember it for the rest of their lives. The calm that settled over the regions after the provocation was quiet, almost peaceful, but beneath it, a change had begun. The humans who had responded so calmly and effectively were not seeking attention or recognition, yet their actions had created ripples that could be felt far and wide. Even those who had once doubted humanity's strength began to take notice. Realizing that something remarkable had occurred, the mountain villagers, still observing from afar, could not ignore the impact of these actions. The younger generation spoke about it often, their curiosity growing with each story. They marveled at the way humans had responded, not with anger or pride, but with courage, patience, and determination. They saw that true strength was not in showing force, but in knowing how to act wisely and effectively when the world seemed to push against them. Even distant communities, connected by travel and trade, began to witness the human response firsthand. Those who had initially caused the tension could not understand why their actions had failed to provoke chaos or destruction. Every effort to intimidate or unsettle humans was met with calm planning and organized action. Humans had anticipated challenges, prepared for unexpected outcomes, and extended help to those who needed it most. Their response was not loud or chaotic, but it was far more effective than anyone could have predicted. This growing awareness spread slowly, like sunlight moving over the hills. People began to talk about the courage and unity they had seen. They shared stories of volunteers traveling long distances to protect the vulnerable, of communities cooperating in ways that had never been seen before, and of humans standing firm without resorting to aggression. It was becoming clear that humanity's strength lay not in force, but in focus, intelligence, and compassion. The provocateurs, growing increasingly frustrated, tried again. They attempted to challenge humans with even greater obstacles, thinking that persistence alone would eventually break their calm. They tried to manipulate situations, to create fear, and to divide communities. Yet each attempt was met with careful preparation, thoughtful coordination, and unwavering resolve. Humans moved quietly, but decisively, offering protection, guidance, and solutions wherever they were needed. Their actions were consistent and deliberate, showing that strength was not about reaction, but about careful, purposeful response. The mountain villagers observed all of this with a mix of awe and understanding. The elders, who had long warned about the consequences of provoking humanity, nodded quietly as the younger generation listened. "Do you see now?" one elder asked. "This is the power of humanity, not in loud conflict or anger, but in courage, empathy, and unity. When humans act together for what is right, they can change the world quietly but powerfully." The young villagers began to grasp the lesson more fully. They realized that humanity's true strength was often invisible to those who judged it superficially. It was measured in patience, collaboration, and the ability to protect the vulnerable. It was seen in the way humans could rise above fear and provocation, acting with clarity, purpose, and moral courage. And it was this strength, more than anything else, that had the power to shift the world as the days passed. Humans continued their efforts to stabilize the situation and support affected communities. They organized assistance for travelers, shared resources, and coordinated communication between villages. Every action reinforced the lesson that humanity's response to provocation was not predictable by traditional measures of power. It was measured by intelligence, unity, and determination. The provocateurs began to see that their attempts to control the situation had failed. They realized, slowly and reluctantly, that humans could not be provoked in the way they had expected. Every effort to create division or fear was met with calm coordination, effective action, and compassion. The human strength was not violent, but it was undeniable. It was strategic, moral, and collective. In the mountain village, the elders spoke with the young villagers about what had been achieved. "Strength is not always loud," one elder explained. "Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and steady. But when humans act with purpose, courage, and unity, their strength becomes a force that cannot be ignored. That is why we have always said, never provoke humanity. Not because it will strike blindly, but because it will rise with a power that changes the world." The young villagers reflected on these words, thinking deeply about what they had seen. They understood that human strength was not about physical ability, weapons, or aggression. It was about moral clarity, preparation, and the courage to act when it mattered most. They realized that unity was humanity's greatest weapon, and that acting together with purpose could shift the course of events in ways no one could anticipate, even those who had once mocked the elders. Warnings began to change their perspective. They spoke quietly among themselves, acknowledging the truth they had once doubted. "We underestimated them," one said. "We thought humans would react with anger or fear, but they acted with purpose and courage. They have strength that cannot be measured in the usual ways." The elders smiled quietly at this, knowing that the lesson had been reinforced. Humanity's power had once again been demonstrated not through violence, but through intelligence, unity, and courage. And the mountain villagers, who had observed these events closely, now carried this understanding in their hearts. As the week went on, the ripple effects of humanity's actions became more visible. Communities that had been divided or fearful began to work together. Trade routes reopened, and cooperation replaced tension. Those who had once doubted or provoked humans realized that their assumptions about weakness or submission had been entirely wrong. Humans had shown that true strength was quiet, deliberate, and deeply moral. The young villagers began to discuss what they had learned. They talked about the calm determination of humans, the thoughtful organization of their actions, and the way people had risen to protect others without seeking recognition. They realized that courage was not about loud displays of power, but about the ability to act wisely and effectively in the face of challenges. They understood that humans could not be provoked without consequence, because their response would be measured, focused, and capable of reshaping the situation entirely. Even as night fell over the village, the lesson remained vivid. Humanity's power was not in chaos or aggression, but in collective action, empathy, and unwavering determination. The provocateurs had failed not because they were weak, but because they had underestimated the quiet strength of people acting together with purpose. The elders spoke once more to the young villagers, their voices soft but full of meaning. "Do not forget this," one said. "The world shifts when humans rise with courage, intelligence, and unity. Their strength is not always visible at first, but it is always there. And when provoked, it can change the course of events in ways that no one expects. That is why we warn you, never provoke humanity." The young villagers listened intently, feeling the truth of the words in their hearts. They realized that humanity's strength was not something to provoke recklessly. It was a force that could rise quietly, protect those in need, and create lasting change. They understood that the elders' warnings were not about fear, but about respect for the power of courage, empathy, and unity. As the night deepened and stars shone over the village, the young villagers reflected on what they had witnessed. They thought about the calm and deliberate response of humans, the thoughtful planning and coordinated action, and the quiet courage that had guided every step. They understood that strength could be measured not in aggression or pride, but in patience, determination, and the ability to rise to challenges with clarity and purpose. Even as they drifted off to sleep, the lesson remained with them. Humanity's capacity to act collectively, with courage and moral clarity, had shifted events far beyond what anyone had imagined. The provocateurs had failed, not because of weakness, but because they had underestimated the quiet, but unstoppable power of humans. The elders whispered to one another in the night, satisfied that the lesson had been witnessed and absorbed. Humanity's strength had been demonstrated once more, not through chaos, anger, or violence, but through focus, courage, and unity. The young villagers would carry this understanding with them, remembering that humans had the power to rise, protect, and change the world in ways that were quietly extraordinary. By dawn, the village was calm, but the understanding had taken root. The younger generation went about their day with a sense of awareness they had never had before. They understood that humanity's true strength was measured in courage, patience, empathy, and unity. They knew that the elders' warnings were not just old stories. They were truths that could guide them and the world in times of challenge. As the sun rose, casting golden light over the village, the elders smiled quietly, knowing that humanity's quiet but powerful strength had once again been witnessed. The young villagers carried the lesson in their hearts, that even the smallest spark, when met with human courage, unity, and intelligence, could change the course of events forever. And in that understanding, the mountain village slept peacefully, carrying with them the knowledge that humanity, when united and focused, had the power to shift the world in ways that were both subtle and extraordinary. The mountain village had grown quiet over the past few weeks, but the air was thick with anticipation. The young villagers had watched the events unfold in neighboring regions and had learned lessons that went far beyond their everyday lives. They now understood something the elders had been trying to teach for generations. Humanity was not to be underestimated. Its strength was not in anger or violence, but in courage, unity, and determination. Even the elders, who had seen countless events and conflicts throughout their long lives, watched carefully as the world responded to the ripple effects of humanity's actions. They knew that the final lessons were about to unfold. The provocateurs, who had tried so hard to create fear and chaos, were still active, but their power had diminished. The humans who had risen to protect and mediate were now moving beyond simple defense. They were shaping the environment around them, guiding communities, and influencing the course of events in ways that few could fully understand. The young villagers were especially attentive. They had seen how humans acted when provoked, calmly, purposefully, and without unnecessary violence. They had watched communities unite, strangers help one another, and vulnerable people protected. It was a lesson in responsibility, courage, and moral clarity. And now, they began to understand that the final stage of the lesson was not about immediate response, it was about influence, leadership, and the long-lasting impact of collective action. By the third day of the new developments, humans were not just responding to challenges, they were shaping outcomes. They helped organize communities, shared resources to build stability, and ensured that communication remained open even in tense situations. Where there had once been fear or doubt, humans brought reassurance and structure. Their presence inspired confidence, even among those who had initially doubted their abilities. The provocateurs, frustrated by their failures, made one last attempt to challenge humanity. They tried to manipulate situations, create obstacles, and test the limits of human patience. But the humans did not respond with anger or impulsive action. They observed carefully, planned strategically, and acted with precision. Every step they took was measured and effective, designed to solve problems and protect those who could not protect themselves. In the mountain village, the young villagers watched these events unfold from a distance. They discussed the implications quietly, absorbing every detail. They saw that human strength was not measured by brute force or loud confrontation. It was measured in the ability to act wisely, to unite communities, and to protect what was right. The elders' warnings, once dismissed by some as old tales, were now understood in a profound living way. Humanity's strength was not something to provoke lightly, and its impact could extend far beyond what anyone imagined. By the fifth day, the humans had achieved something remarkable. Communities that had been divided, fearful, or uncertain were now working together. Trade routes reopened, resources were shared, and cooperation replaced tension. The provocateurs' attempts to disrupt, divide, or intimidate had failed completely. Humans had demonstrated that their power was not only in response, but in initiative, the ability to guide outcomes and create stability. Where chaos had once threatened, the young villagers were in awe. They had watched humans act with a level of unity and focus that was beyond what they had thought possible. They began to understand that true strength was a combination of courage, moral clarity, empathy, and cooperation. It was quiet, deliberate, and extraordinarily effective. The elders, noticing the young villagers' understanding, nodded quietly, satisfied that the lesson had been absorbed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky turned shades of gold and pink, the elders gathered the young villagers. "You have seen it with your own eyes," one said gently. "Humanity is not to be provoked, not because it will react with anger, but because it rises with strength, clarity, and unity. Even the smallest spark, when met with this force, can change the world. And that is why our warning exists, to remind every generation of what humans are truly capable of." The young villagers listened closely, feeling the truth of these words resonate deeply within them. They realized that strength was not always obvious or visible. It could be subtle, quiet, and patient. Yet, when humans acted together with purpose, the results were powerful, irreversible, and awe-inspiring. They understood that the elders' caution was not about fear, it was about respect for the quiet, extraordinary strength that lay within every human when circumstances demanded it. The night settled over the mountain village, calm and serene, but the understanding among the young villagers was anything but still. They talked quietly under the stars about the courage they had witnessed, the careful planning, and the collective efforts that had protected communities and guided outcomes. They reflected on the humanity that could unite, act, and change the world without needing to rely on aggression or chaos. Even those who had once doubted or mocked the elders' words were beginning to understand. They spoke softly among themselves about what had been achieved, realizing that their assumptions about human weakness had been entirely wrong. Humanity had shown that its strength was not just physical or tactical, it was moral, strategic, and enduring. It could rise when provoked, act decisively when needed, and reshape the world quietly, but effectively. The elders observed this shift in understanding with quiet satisfaction. They knew that the lessons had been witnessed, understood, and absorbed. Humanity's power had been demonstrated once again, not through loud displays, chaos, or anger, but through intelligence, unity, courage, and compassion. The young villagers had learned that strength could be quiet, thoughtful, and profoundly impactful, capable of changing events in ways that others could not predict. As the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light over the village, the young villagers reflected on everything they had seen. They thought about how humans had protected vulnerable communities, coordinated efforts across regions, and acted with patience and purpose. They realized that the provocation had not broken humanity, it had revealed its true strength. And they understood that this strength was not fleeting. It was enduring, passed from generation to generation, ready to rise whenever the world needed it. By dawn, the village was peaceful, but the lessons remained alive. The young villagers went about their day with a sense of awareness and responsibility that had not been there before. They understood that human strength was measured not by violence or pride, but by courage, empathy, unity, and moral clarity. They carried with them the knowledge that provocation could be met not with chaos, but with calm, deliberate action capable of changing the world forever. Over the following days, the ripple effects of humanity's actions became more apparent. Communities continued to cooperate, communication improved, and trust was rebuilt where it had been broken. Those who had sought to provoke humans gradually realized that their efforts had been futile. The human strength was not something they could control, intimidate, or manipulate. It was a force of resilience, courage, and unity that had no equal. In the mountain village, the elders gathered the young villagers one final time. "You have witnessed the power of humanity," one elder said. "Do not forget it. Strength is not always visible, and courage is not always loud. But when humans act together, guided by purpose, empathy, and determination, they can shift the course of events in ways no one expects. That is why we always say, never provoke humanity." The young villagers nodded, fully absorbing the lesson. They understood that humanity's strength was extraordinary, quiet, yet undeniable. It could rise in the face of challenge, protect the vulnerable, unite communities, and change the world in ways that could not be undone. The elders' warning was no longer a distant story. It was a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. As the sun rose over the mountains once more, bathing the village in golden light, the young villagers felt a sense of connection and responsibility. They knew that the lesson was not just about observing humanity. It was about understanding it, respecting it, and carrying forward the courage, unity, and determination that defined it. The elders smiled quietly, knowing that their teachings had been received. Humanity had been tested and had proven its strength once again, not through violence or anger, but through courage, unity, and thoughtful action. The young villagers, inspired and aware, would remember this lesson and share it with generations to come. And in that quiet mountain village, under the golden morning sun, the world seemed a little brighter, a little stronger, and a little more hopeful. Humanity had risen, had acted with purpose, and had shifted the course of events quietly but forever. The lesson was clear, enduring, and unforgettable. Humanity's true power lay not in provocation or force, but in courage, unity, and the strength to act for what is right.